I'm going to come back to this slide and talk about these periods in just a little bit more detail. But let me just start out by acknowledging that this chapter covers a very long period, as you probably gathered by looking at your very long study guide. And we won't even be delving into Egypt under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, at least for now. I just included them to give you a sense of the time period. But we're still looking at 2,500 years, more or less. And to put that in perspective, 2,500 years will pretty much cover, is a time period that will pretty much cover the rest of this course. So we will go from here, this is a pre-classical Greek statue, to the Byzantines, to the Renaissance, to modern day, and even beyond. And let's put this in perspective by taking a look at Egypt over the same period. We will go from here to here to here. Doesn't look like we're seeing all that much change. So why is Egyptian culture, and with it Egyptian art, so extraordinarily stable? We don't really have time to go into that in the kind of detail I'd love to and Ms. Jacobs would love to, but let's take a look at these kingdoms and try to get a sense of the sweep of Egyptian history, and then I'm going to go back to the question of why it remains so stable. The Old Kingdom, and by the way, the question you're probably asking a la Seinfeld is, do you need to know dates? The answer is yes, but only up to a point. Sometimes the AP exam will give you date parameters. You need a list of work after 1500 or something like that. And it's possible that you will need to know the difference between an old and a new kingdom work. But you aren't going to need to know specific dates in this very long period. Just a general sense. The Old Kingdom is the period basically in the 2000s. And one of the ways to keep Old Kingdom architecture straight is that the Old Kingdom is the age of the pyramids. It's the age of the Great Pyramids. So if they're asking you a question about pyramids, it's probably asking about the Old Kingdom. In fact, something your book doesn't talk about, but which I think is quite interesting, is it's probably pyramids that brought the Old Kingdom down. I have a candidate for an AP question that will never get asked on the test. They'll ask all the time about how art reflects culture or how art supports culture, reinforces culture. How about the question of how art destroys culture? Contrary to common myth, slaves did not build the Great Pyramids. They were, in fact, huge public works projects and were a way of employing people during the period when the Nile was flooding and no agriculture could take place. But they cost a great deal of money, and they required huge workforces. We'll see more of this when we get to the architecture lecture. The pharaohs assembled these workforces basically by working through regional governors or nomarchs, and eventually the huge cost of the pyramids required them to give more and more power to these nomarchs in order to get the workforce they needed. The nomarchs eventually challenged central rule. The Old Kingdom fell. You have a period of disorder, and the Middle Kingdom is then ushered in, and we have another period of stable rule by dynasties of pharaohs. Now, I probably shouldn't say this. I actually feel a little guilty, but the Middle Kingdom is unlikely to appear on your AP exam. Now, there may be a Middle Kingdom question or two on your unit exam, so don't ignore it entirely. The Middle Kingdom is really most noted for the military conquests, and in fact, Middle Kingdom architecture is extremely important. It's just almost all took the form of fortifications. In fact, it was really the Egyptians who came up with most of the architectural techniques that would later be used in castles. Castles, unfortunately, don't show up in our course either, or maybe given all that we have to cover, fortunately. So you aren't going to have to worry much about the Middle Kingdom architecture, and Middle Kingdom sculpture and painting looks, frankly, an awful lot like, as you may have guessed, Old Kingdom and New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is the golden age of Ramses and others, much of which you associate with Egyptian art. King Tut's famous mummy, for example, is from the New Kingdom. But the pharaohs had learned something from the experience of the Old Kingdom. And although they continue to have huge architectural projects, they moved from pyramids to constructing temples. And so, again, a hint for the AP test. If it's a question about pyramids, it's probably the Old Kingdom. If it's a question about temples, it's probably the New Kingdom. So let me return to the question I posed but really didn't answer, which is why such incredible stability, both in Egyptian culture and in Egyptian art? And that's a very, very complicated question, and, very long books have been written on this subject, but the map gives us a little bit of a clue. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It extends thousands of miles, and it goes beyond what's shown here in this map down into what is now Sudan and even Ethiopia. But the Nile created agricultural land that was really only a couple of miles wide on either side. In other words, the Kingdom of Egypt is very, very long, but not very wide. On either side, beyond the area where the Nile floods, you have essentially impenetrable desert. That was important because it actually made it quite tricky to invade Egypt. When it was invaded successfly, it almost always happened along the Nile, from the south, from Nubia, or what's now Sudan, or from the north via the Mediterranean Sea, the Hyksos people. But they were not as subject to invasion as the Mesopotamians, and therefore they were not as polyglot a people. You had a single unified empire. The long, narrow country, on the one hand, made it very difficult to rule and you really needed a unified administrative state. On the other hand, you could reach every part of that state relatively easily through the Nile. So again, you have a largely stable culture. The Nile's flooding itself is highly predictable, unlike the Tigris and Euphrates. You are not as subject to invasion. And so the groundwork is laid for a society of extraordinary stability. It also had an ideology that reinforced stability, but we'll talk more about that when we get to our next lecture on art. Let me just make one last note, because I think this is confusing. Lower Egypt is in the north and Upper Egypt is in the south, and that's because the Nile flows toward the Mediterranean. So the Upper Egypt is the upper portion of the Nile, which is south. The capital of Lower Egypt is Memphis. This is also the capital during the Old Kingdom period, and then it moves to Thebes in Upper Egypt. That you don't really have to keep your Egyptian geography straight much beyond that. Let me close by a hymn that dates from the New Kingdom, and I think gives us a bit of a feeling for the role of the Pharaoh, and that's going to be so central to the art and architecture and painting that we're going to look at in the next 3 lectures that I wanted to share this with you. So he has come unto us and has taken the 2 lands under his protection. He has given peace to the 2 riverbanks. He has come unto us and made Egypt to live. He has banished its suffering. He has come unto us and has made the people to live. He has caused the throat of his subjects to breathe. At the heart of Egyptian ideology, politics, culture, and art is the pharaoh, the ruler who placates the gods, petitions to the gods, channels the gods, if you will, and finally becomes a god, or actually is one kind of god on earth and another kind of god after his death. But this godlike status does not actually mean that the pharaoh can do anything he wants to. In fact, we'll see that when we get to a pharaoh who tried to completely change Egyptian society just according to his own will. Most Egyptian pharaohs accepted their responsibility to maintain ma'at, right order and harmony. Pharaohs brought ma'at to Egypt, but they also were subject to ma'at and were responsible for enforcing it. So this New Kingdom poem sums up the pharaoh's role. He is sent by the gods. Without him, the people would suffer and die. It's little wonder that they are willing to serve him in life and afterlife. And now we will move on to Egyptian sculpture, architecture, and painting.